It was April 8, 1943, when a soldier, barely able to hold his pen, wrote his final words in a small journal. The desert wind was screaming, and fine sand whipped against his cracked skin. His companions were weak, blind from the storm, some already dead. He wrote that they couldn't go on any longer. Just days earlier, they were 9 strong, flying high in a B-24 bomber through the skies over North Africa. Now they were alone, dying slowly under the ruthless sun of the Sahara Desert. His name was Lieutenant Robert Toner, and the journal in his hand would one day reveal one of the most haunting survival stories to emerge from the Second World War. So how did 9 trained American airmen go from flying a powerful bomber to being lost in one of the harshest environments on Earth? What happened during those final hours in the desert? And why did it take 16 years for the world to learn the truth? What was in that journal that stunned even the military? Welcome back to History Short Stories channel. To find out, stay with me until the end. This is not just a story about a missing plane. It's about courage, confusion, and a tragic mistake that cost 8 lives in slow, agonizing silence. It began on April 4, 1943, at the Salak airfield in Libya. A brand new B-24 Liberator bomber, nicknamed Lady Be Good, was preparing for its very first combat mission. On board were 9 young men, full of energy, determination, and nerves. Their target was in Naples, Italy, a bombing run against enemy positions as part of the Allied push through Europe. Missions like these were dangerous but routine. Usually, dozens of bombers would fly together in formation, dropping their explosives in waves. But Lady Be Good got delayed. When it finally took off, the other bombers were already far ahead, leaving it isolated in the sky. As the aircraft climbed over the endless brown expanse of the Sahara, strong winds began to rise. The desert is deceptive. One moment calm, the next, a roaring sandstorm. Visibility dropped, sand filled the air, and the horizon vanished into a golden blur. Many of the bombers turned back. It was too risky. But the crew of Lady Be Good made a bold decision. They pushed forward into the storm, determined to complete their mission. Hours later, they finally reached the Naples area. The target, however, was completely covered. The storm had followed them. Dropping bombs accurately was impossible. With no other choice, they turned around and headed back for base. It was now after midnight. The crew was exhausted. The sky over the desert was pitch black. But then, something went terribly wrong. Their navigational instruments, which should have guided them home, failed. The automatic direction finder had stopped working, leaving them flying blind over a sea of sand. Radio contact was attempted. They called for help, sent signals, but heard nothing back. It's still unclear whether their messages weren't received or simply weren't answered. Down at the airfield, base personnel fired flares into the night sky, hoping to guide them back. But the storm swallowed everything. No lights were seen, no sounds heard. The crew had no idea they had already flown past the base. They believed they were still far from land, flying above the Mediterranean Sea, when in fact they were headed deeper and deeper into the Sahara. They flew on for nearly 2 more hours. Fuel gauges dropped to 0. At around 2 a.m., the pilot gave the order. They had to abandon the aircraft. One by one, the crew jumped into the night, their parachutes opening in the silent dark above the desert. Below them waited a deadly landscape of rock, sand, and freezing cold. Their bomber, empty and alone, continued flying until it crashed into the desert floor miles away. But the men had survived the jump. What they didn't know was that the real fight had just begun. When the sun rose over the Sahara on April 5, 1943, 9 parachutes lay scattered across the endless golden dunes. The crew of Lady Be Good had survived the fall, but they had landed in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. There were no roads, no landmarks, and no signs of life in any direction. Just heat, silence, and sand. The men regrouped as best they could. One of them, Sergeant John Waravka, was missing, either lost during the jump or killed on impact. The other stood in disbelief, staring at the horizon. There was no wreckage in sight, no planes, no help, only wind, sun, and the vast emptiness of the Libyan desert. Among the survivors was Lieutenant Robert Toner. In the chaos of their landing, he had managed to keep something precious with him, a small leather-bound notebook. He began to write, not knowing if anyone would ever read it. His first entry was simple, direct, and chilling. "Things have completely gone wrong," he wrote. "We got lost while returning, and the plane ran out of fuel. At 2 a.m., we had to jump into the desert. All of us are here, but John is nowhere to be seen." That first day, they did what they could. They gathered what supplies supplies they had: a single canteen of water, a few chocolate bars, a pistol. Some were injured from the landing. Most had no protection from the sun. As the desert heat climbed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, they huddled together, rationing water by the sip, hoping a rescue plane would appear. But no one came. The second day passed in agony. The journal continued. "Nothing new to report," Toner wrote. "Many people are injured. We only have half a bottle of water left." The heat, he said, felt like poison. They spent most of the day lying still, trying not to sweat. Every drop of moisture now meant survival. But their bodies were weakening. The desert sun burned through their clothes. Their lips cracked. Their eyes dried and blistered from the swirling sand. By day 3, they realized they couldn't wait any longer. If rescue wasn't coming to them, they would have to find it themselves. At 5 o'clock, Toner wrote, "We started walking. They didn't know it, but they were heading north, the opposite direction of the crashed plane, and further away from any chance of being found. Each night, the desert turned against them again. The air dropped below freezing. Their sweat-soaked clothes became ice cold. They had no shelter, no fire, and no sleep. They wrapped themselves in pieces of parachute fabric and curled up against each other to survive the cold. Then each morning, they stood and walked again, eyes burned from sun and sand, shoes falling apart, muscles failing, but they kept going. By the 4th day, the journal entries grew darker. Same routine. Everyone is exhausted. No one can sleep. We don't know how long this will continue. On the 5th day, we can't bear this anymore. Sam is dead. Everyone else's eyes have been damaged by the sand. They were now dying one by one. April 9th, 1943. 7 days since the men had jumped into the desert. In Robert Toner's journal, his words were now slower, heavier. "Shelley has left the group," he wrote. "He's gone in another direction to look for help. The rest of us can no longer move. Nights are freezing cold." That was the last line he ever wrote. After that, silence. No more entries. No more signs of life. The Sahara, vast and cruel, swallowed the rest of the story for the next 16 years. Back at the Salak airfield, no one truly knew what had happened. With no communication from the crew and no wreckage found, the military assumed Lady Be Good had crashed into the Mediterranean Sea. A few scattered search operations were launched, but with the war still raging across Europe and North Africa, a single missing bomber was just one of many. Eventually, the mission was declared a loss. The 9 men were listed as missing in action, and their families were left with only silence and unanswered questions. Then, in November 1958, everything changed. A British oil exploration team flying over a remote section of the Libyan desert spotted something unusual glinting in the sun. It was metal, scattered and weathered, but unmistakably aircraft debris. The coordinates were marked, but at the time, no one made the connection. Months later, a ground crew returned to inspect the site. What they found stunned them. The wreckage was a US B-24 bomber, still eerily intact despite the years. Its name was painted on the fuselage, Lady Be Good. The discovery triggered a full military investigation. Teams from the US Air Force were dispatched to the crash site. What they saw was unlike anything they expected. The aircraft had broken in two but was shockingly well preserved. Machine guns were still mounted in place. Radios, still functional. Even a thermos inside the cockpit still held drinkable tea. But there was one thing missing: the crew. No bodies, no parachutes, no signs of what had happened to the men. It was clear now that they had bailed out before the crash. But where had they gone? The answer came a year later, in 1960, when the US Army launched a deeper search through the surrounding desert. Dozens of miles away from the crash site, 5 mummified bodies were discovered, partially buried beneath the sand. Near one of them lay a small, weathered notebook, the personal journal of Robert Toner. Page by page, the haunting truth unfolded. Through his words, investigators pieced together the men's final journey, their parachute jump, their decision to walk north in search of rescue, and the slow, painful deaths that followed. Toner's entries, dated day by day, ended after the 8th, confirming that at least some of the men had survived more than a week in the desert with barely any food or water. But that wasn't the end. A final mission, codenamed Operation Climax, was launched to recover the remaining bodies. It took months, but eventually 2 more crew members were found, over 20 miles beyond the others. One of them was Shelley, the man who had walked off alone, still trying to find help long after the rest had fallen. The last crew member, the one who never regrouped after the parachute jump, was presumed to have died instantly when he hit the ground. In the end, none of the 9 men made it out alive. They had survived their crash. They had survived the jump, but they could not survive the Sahara. Today, the story of Lady Be Good is remembered not just as a military mystery, but as a human tragedy. A perfect storm of bad luck, broken equipment, and impossible geography, combined with the brutal truth that even the strongest men cannot outwalk the desert. Their journey, now preserved in Robert Toner's journal, is a story of bravery in the face of hopelessness. A story of 9 men who stayed together as long as they could, and walked farther than anyone thought possible. Somewhere in the sands of Libya, the wind still blows across the wreckage. Time has buried most of the evidence, but if you listen closely, you might still hear voices in the wind, voices from a lost bomber, echoing the final pages of a journal left behind. This was the story of Lady Be Good. If it moved you, if it made you pause and think, then share it, because stories like this deserve to be remembered, not for the war, but for the men who fought to live long after the mission was over.